Philosophers in space.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to Philosophers in Space. I am your captain, Callie Wright, joined by my chief ethics officer, Aaron Rabinowitz. Aaron, how are things, my friend?
Every day, a new adventure in ethics land. It's good, though. It is a good adventure. We are enjoying this adventure. We are excited to be a part of it. We are very, very mostly happy.
You, I, we are going on an adventure. You, I, we, us, they are going to have a great time this week. And I'm just very excited. Everything is better now. Trust me.
Right? The anti-woke were like, we don't like pronouns. And Adrian was like, hold my typewriter? I don't know. Gooey typewriter bug creature, I guess.
I was praying for the
what I was going to hold.
Badass landing you can come up with.
I didn't have anything there. I have very little.
I love you to pieces, but maybe workshop that one a little more.
No, I didn't get to the Cronenberg fast enough, and that's my fault. I will work on that. I'm listening and learning here.
We get there. We all get there sometimes. Well, that feels like the housekeeping out of the way, Aaron. I think is it time for us to dive in?
Yeah, we've got our house in order, so I guess let's head on an adventure.
All right, let's plot me.
All right, so we're deep into part 2 territory here. Do you want to...
Deep into part 2, yeah. And a lot has happened. Gosh. We left off last time right around the time that the virus gets sent out from Earth and destroys all of the old Empire tech. Mm-hmm. And the luck, the stroke of luck that the octopuses had taken the ship out of commission such that it wasn't affected by the virus. Our sweet, sweet tentacly babies.
They're such good boys. And
Can we use the gender questionable beings?
Well, yeah, so that's the question. Is the word boy, B-O-I, gendered or gender neutral? Can you just use that as like a gender neutral for all good boys in that sense?
That's a good question. Because, it does generally denote some like gender messiness of some kind, some gender F-wordery if we weren't PG-13. So maybe, I don't know. That's
okay. We'll take it under advisement, and
yeah,
I will use boy in what I believe to be the neutral internet sense, in which everyone can be a good boy.
So as all this is happening, and after it's happening, there's a lot of really cool like world building that shows how the Portiids and the humans have learned to work together. We learn how Fabian learns to sigh, which is great. I'm a big fan. Like, This is an important enough thing that I just have to learn how to communicate this concept.
And it's something we didn't get to talk about in the language, the language bridging part of the episode, where there were so many different kinds of like ways you have to bridge language. We didn't even get into like the subtleties of emotive bodily responses, like that kind of thing, and how those would be shaped by, the emotive, like the biological capacities of the different organisms. So portids that like barely breathe because they have their weird lungs, like that would not be a thing for them.
Mm-hmm. And part of what is happening in the story as we're getting this is that they're planning to go down to this planet to explore it, to see what's going on, because they get there and they're surprised to find that there is a thriving ecosystem on this planet, which they did not expect to find. And they're preparing for this while this world building is happening, showing off how these folks have learned to work together. Just a fun couple of notes here. Apparently the department these folks work in is called Alarmed Feet. They are the Alarmed Feet department, which
because
that's got to become a running gag in the show somewhere, because that just feels correct.
That is really good. And I think the idea is that they're the reaction squad when one of the drones that got sent out, like essentially like a string in the web gets plucked. And they react in that way. So I love that as a way of how they conceptualize the expanding of their race, their community.
Yeah, and along with that, we get the detail that a lot of the folks wear these like really soft socks, so the spiders don't feel like they're being yelled at constantly. Which
Right,
is just
right.
so good.
And I wonder, like, they don't say a ton of like the physical way that like living in a thing made out of spider web would work, but you'd have to imagine that
Right.
like you kind of it's going to have like a lot of bouncy to it. Like you can control the tensile strength, but like
Right.
you know they could control it in such a way where it's all going to be like soft, cushiony kind of thing.
Yeah.
I wonder if they have like drum plates where they can communicate very clearly or loudly or something.
Oh God, I need more Adrian Tchaikovsky.
Always more world. Build more.
I just need it more.
Okay,
we have,
so we already talked about the
talking-
big fight, I think, right? The like first fight.
Yeah. Because God, it makes me so angry how they lead right up to the fight where they reveal that it is the octopuses, and I'm just like, I'm so excited for figuring out finally what these things are to confirm my suspicion, and then we get like 3 chapters of the past before we actually get that information, and I was very upset about it and remain very upset about it.
Yep, no, it's cruel. And you know, we talked a little bit, I think, about the octo technology and like the way that they create a story in which it's possible for these things to be in space. But one of the things that I really wanted to emphasize in this one that I don't think we talked about as much as one of like the highlights for me is the way there's an interesting kind of contrast between the octo technology and the octo minds. You know, throughout all these stories, it's all about like how does the nature of this creature's mind shape its technology and stuff like that. And you see some of that in the like, you know, everything's kind of piecemeal, the way the ships are pulled together. But in the basic physics of it, it's like the opposite, because you have these giant motherships that are full of water, you know, and they can't move fast once they get, you know, once they get going, they can't turn very well. They can't like, you know, they're not rapid response the way that the octos themselves are very rapid response kind of creatures. You do have the little drones that like represent that more, but I just think it's very interesting the way that the nature of water physics is such that there's only so much you can do to control the physics of giant bodies of water, apparently. And so you end up with these like really silly, globy looking ships.
Yeah. And the thread that is being explored in the other part, in the other timeline, is the actual meeting between the human portiids and the octopuses, where they perceive that they have been sent an invitation because it's because I think the octopuses send them like an older docking code, and so they're like, oh, okay, this is obviously an invitation for us to join. And there's all kinds of cool stuff about how the ships pull together. There's some really good visual of Paul like squeezing his way through the bottlenecks of the ship and like working his way into the chamber, being very hesitant to meet these aliens and very curious at the same time.
Right. We should basically sort of explain, like, after the initial like exchange of fire, they create a little globe that's like a meeting room.
Yeah.
And the ships can both like dock at it, and they go swimming into this little like, and the cool thing is these ships are all built around force field technology. So they are like containing these globes of water in the middle of space, which like if you try to visualize it, what a horrifying experience that would be. You're just like, there's no walls. You can't see anything. It's just water and then space. That would be creepy, really, really creepy. And then they make it even worse when things start to go south in that particular sequence, right? You know?
Yeah. And I love the picture they paint where they're the human, I forget the human's name that's with them, has the tablet that's just displaying, because like they've worked out that displaying colors and shapes is sort of generally how the octopuses communicate with one another. And so they have this tablet that just changes colors and stuff. And for a second, Paul considers the tablet as the intelligence that he's dealing with.
Right. It's very much like Hitchhikers, you know, you try to shake hands with the car kind of situation. Right. But no, it's also, you have such great moments where like you get the sense from the octos that they're like these poor trapped creatures and their lack of appendages and stuff. Like, I remember seeing a meme online once where people were like, do octopi nightmares involve creatures with like really rigid limbs and stuff? Like, like very solid, bony. And that's kind of the vibe you get from Paul when he's trying to meet these creatures. It's super funny.
Yeah.
But but then something bad, what happens is the octos start fighting, which is so funny, right? Like in the midst of this delicate, diplomatic first contact where like everybody's trying hard to communicate, like half the octos decide they don't like this idea anymore and want to just fight. And they freeze the orb, which is one of the scariest things in the book, I think. They basically use some sort of technology to just like take that water orb and just like freeze it solid where everyone inside of it survives, and then just like we're out, kind of thing. I loved that. I loved all of that as a like unique experience of like first contact.
Mm-hmm. And parallel to that, next we get them actually like dispatching their expedition to this planet. They're exploring around. We get a little bit of more cool world building, talking about all of the different creatures that exist on this planet. And they start hinting at what is to come, in that a lot of the observations end up being about how these seemingly individual life forms seem to be functioning more collectively in a way that isn't super obvious from the outside.
Well, we should be clear, you're talking about in the past, because like again, there's two timelines going in this show.
Yeah. So, that's like as we move back into the past, this is happening. And I think the way the storytelling in the book works is like after we get that scene where the octopuses start fighting with each other, it switches back into the past, and we get that bit of exploration.
Right. It's hard because again, like it is very back and forth in a way that's like great and enjoyable, but it's difficult to kind of progress the two plots, simultaneously explaining. But yeah, in the past, so we should explain sort of what happens with the two planets after the virus, I think, a little bit. So the virus hits, right? Desi survives in the spaceship, in their original ship with the Octos because of the reboot. But everybody who was sent down to the planet in the shuttle gets fried on the way down, and they all die. And poor Desi is traumatized by that and never wants to send anyone down the well again. And then at the same time, this was right when they were going to first go down and explore the other planet Nod with its life forms, and they get fried on the way down, or fried while they're down there, I think, actually. Yeah. And they get stuck down there with no way to get out, essentially. And would have, in theory, died if Desi hadn't survived enough and had like backup technology to go pick them up, essentially, when they reboot. Right.
And we get this really neat description of these tortoises that live on this planet. And this is one of my favorite parts of this section of the book, is that we essentially get a zombie apocalypse because you got stabbed by a tortoise, which is just the most wonderfully weird way to kick off any sort of like zombie-like situation. You get stabbed by a tortoise, and everybody's trying to figure out like, what's that about? Like, they make reference to the Nodin version of this tortoise like trying to hump the guy's leg. Was it something as innocent as that? Because they say like, oh, like we've been attacked, and then there's a little bit of a debate about like, we're not dealing with a consciousness here. Of course, that's not it.
Right.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Right. And I really love the Nod sequences because, if you watch something like the movie Prometheus, you can complain about the cavalier way by which people sort of get themselves murdered or infected by various things. But like these folks, as best they can, especially dealing in that particular crisis, are still very sort of cautious about trying to make sure that there isn't going to be some weird thing out there infecting them. And, like they do a bunch of prior studies before they even go down to the planet and map all of the different life forms. There doesn't appear to be, any like dangerous apex predators or anything like that. So there's really no like indication of a significant risk until this moment, except for the kind of growing sense of like something good is not going to happen to these people. But yeah, and then he gets stabbed. And what they noticed was there's a difference between some kinds of tortoises, and that some kinds of tortoises have a goo in them that other kinds of tortoises don't have, and the ones that have that
Relatable.
goo, yeah,
Relatable.
right, you get that, you get how that works. You know, you got like a low level Squirtle, and then you got an upgraded Squirtle situation. I don't know what level 2 of Squirtle is. I apologize. You know. And what they find out, right, is that this goo is actually its own separate life form that's a kind of like parasite. If anybody's been watching The Last of Us, this will all sound very familiar to you.
Yeah, I had that exact same thought. Like, it feels very familiar. And it's interesting how they go through the discussion of like trying to figure out what this stuff even is. Like, is it an infection? Is it like what is happening with this? And, you know, they go through all of these like really harsh medical treatments, and it seems like if memory serves, it's like, well, it's not like this stuff is gone, but everything else seems to be functioning okay, and so it feels like maybe we've won. And they don't stop worrying about it at all completely, but they're like, we think we're good here, we think we're set, and then we are suddenly very not.
Yeah, and it's a great piece of dramatic irony because this is interspersed, you know, like the guy gets stabbed, he gets brought back in, they're trying to like check him and stuff, and these sequences are interspersed with more of these like I, we, thou chapters. And there's a chapter about like this creature, this thing, they end up calling like the creature from Nod, I think, if not in this book, then in the second book, or the third book rather. You know, and it's like its perspective of like being inside of a human. And, you know, when they were talking about the like what on this planet could hurt us, one of the things they highlighted was like, look, this is a completely separate evolutionary system. There's nothing here that we can even consume or could consume us. Like, unless something tried to eat us and like couldn't digest us, there's like nothing that could, you know, there's not going to be any, you know, diseases that could even interact with our body, is the way they kind of are thinking about it. And in this first person perspective, well, like, I don't know if first is the right way, second person perspective of the creature from Nod, you know, like, what is I, we, thou as a perspective? Anyway, that's part two. The creature is describing how it's like the geometries are all wrong and it's getting destroyed and everything is hot and painful and terrible until it like learns to adapt to being inside of humans. It's just a great, you know, accounting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a weird stream of consciousness thing, but it's like a stream of collective consciousness, which is just, it's very interesting to think about. Well, and then this is maybe more the philosophy side of things, but I feel like just in terms of plot, I feel like Adrian does such a good job of like weaving those thoughts in a way that like it feels like it makes sense. It feels very alien, the thought process, and like thinking about what that experience would be like. Obviously, I don't think any of us have a real world experience of what that thing is like, but it makes sense. There's sort of a developing level of consciousness as they expand and like take over more and more life forms, and they have these realizations about the way things work, and it's interesting. The narrative talks about Lortiz, if memory serves, is the name of the guy who was first infected. It like talks about his
or Lourdes. I don't know. But yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I read it as Lourdes, but I'm terrible with names, as we all know. So
yeah, reading the audiobook, I'm pretty sure it was Lortiz, but yeah, not the most important thing. But from a third person storytelling perspective, it is explaining a lot of his like subjective individual experiences, because it talks about like the tinges of his vision turning yellow and him like being sort of overcome with a sense of euphoria, like, wow, everything is great now. And it was a little unsettling in a way that it was satisfying as taking the story in, but it's hearing a third person perspective describing a person's subjective experience in that way is very, like, it's weird. It's very weird and uncomfortable, but in a way that feels cool, I think.
Yeah, and first of all, I think probably I went with Lourdes because I was thinking Lourdes and the tortoise.
I don't know what that is.
The stabby tortoise. Funny. You know, the tortoise. It's just like, you know.
Oh, okay.
Lourdes gets stabbed by a tortoise.
I was thinking there was like a kid's story or something.
No,
that you do.
no, totally unimportant. Not at all.
Got it.
It's just the way my brain does things wrong. But one thing I really liked about that description is I realized after the fact that it's a kind of rapid uplifting. We've talked a lot about kinds of uplifting in these stories, the sort of slow uplifting through evolution or through the virus or something like that. But the way the creature from Nod describes it is that like literally whole universes suddenly open up to this creature as it absorbs the knowledge of this human, because it was previously just like a low level, its sort of consciousness could only be as expansive as the most evolved creature that it was a part of, essentially. Right. So it didn't have a consciousness beyond tortoise level. It just walks around going tortoise, tortoise, tortoise. There was actually a great part in there where it described that like a couple of them that were infected clustered together and they thought it was like, is this a graveyard or something? But it does so remind you of the like bugs that like go up the tops of the plants when they have the fungal infection, and also the like euphoria. But I just like the idea of, suddenly this creature realizes that there is so much bigger a universe open to it, so much more possibilities, because it's a copycat. So it can only be as advanced as the things around it. But it now has this massive sudden bootstrapping. And that's where we get this wonderful line where it learns the concept of adventure and says, we're going on an adventure in the most creepy possible way that anything ever could. But it also, like that wonderful joy, the pleasure the creature has is paralleled with what you described, essentially a zombie sequence where it murders and takes over the whole hub.
Yeah, in like very explicitly violent ways, like it's like stabbing someone with your fingers.
Oh yeah.
And there's like the doctor gets a hold of this syringe and is like trying to stick him with the syringe to neutralize whatever is part, and like he gets a hold of the syringe at some point if I remember right, and it's like it's very intense, and which is cool because there's not a ton of what we might traditionally call action in these books, but like the couple of times it happens, it's so good.
Yep. No, it's very short, sharp violence, and I really love it. Kind of like in the first book, for example, the taking of the ant colony or stuff like that. Yeah. Like the battle sequences. We should talk a little bit about the creature from Nod's biology, and then we can talk about its sort of mind and philosophy behind that, I think, in the second half. But like the way that they work it out, and I think, this is sort of pieced together by multiple entities, because at one point some octopi go like in the mid periods between the two main stories, some of the octopi do some research on this thing as well, and they get in trouble for that, and that shows up later. There's too many subplots, but anyway, the key thing is that this is like a single cellular organism, but that has sort of infinite possibility for informational complexity in its cellular wall kind of idea. And the way they describe it is just very, very dense. It's not, I think they say it's not either purely sort of animal or vegetable. It's kind of weird mix or something like that. You see this in some other sci-fis where it's like, this is a creature that just like its DNA is super denser, or, in some ways it packs more information into the cellular level than other creatures do. And the way that I understand this one, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I think the impression is supposed to be that every cell of this thing has the same complete knowledge. Right.
Yeah. It's like a sci-fi blockchain.
Right. Exactly. In that I do not understand how it works. I cannot make sense of what it would look like in my own head, but I appreciate the concept abstractly.
And I know that's not actually a fully good metaphor. It was just something that popped into my head.
Oh, I think we can totally run with that metaphor. I feel like blockchains are the sort of things that seem harmless and then stab you in the leg. That seems, exactly like what a blockchain would do.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't even gone that far with it.
The creature from Nod is really the embodiment of move fast and break things.
That's true. It actually does that.
That's literally the next thing it does, is that it gets on a ship to try to go break the octopi. And by break, I mean become one with, right? Because it really is like from its own perspective, I think a benevolent creature in the sense that it just wants to understand and be friends with everybody and like absorb everybody into itself so that, we can all just be one. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the part 3. But like what other plot points we want to cover, I think are probably its attempts to get off planet, which is the next step. Right. Yeah. There's sort of like 2 important sort of, I think, what would you call them? Set pieces here, right? So there's the first one where the captain, who I think is, I don't think it's Lortiz who makes it off. It might be Lortiz who makes it off, but one of the people ends up making it off of the planet in the like escape shuttle, essentially infected with this creature. Right. It's either the captain. I think it may be the captain actually.
It's Baltiel.
Yeah, Baltiel, right, because it's kind of his dramatic fall from hubris, essentially. He hops in the ship and he's like, I'm going to go meet the octopi. We're going on an adventure. And at this point, I think Desi is still alive and sees this coming and relays the information to the Octos.
Yeah. And this is actually in the midst of this sequence. Like right before that, we learn about what Sinkavi's relationship evolves into with the octopuses. And this was something that I love the octopuses so much. I'm going to say that so many times throughout this whole thing. But they talk about how, for how long it's been, they never develop a way to communicate super specifically and effectively with each other. It's like more akin to knowing a little bit of the vocabulary and a little bit of the grammar of each other's languages such that you can communicate sort of broad concepts, but you can't do like specific granular communication. And like Sinkavi and the octopuses both understand this and do it anyways. And I very much get the vibe that the octopuses are just like, we just want our dad to be proud. So we're just going to let him know what we're up to at all times. In terms of redoing all of the terraforming equipment for their own purposes. It's very sweet. And as like right after we get this explanation is when we see the shuttle heading in for this planet, and Sinkavi realizes what's happening and doesn't think that he can stop it, and he's losing it a little bit.
Yeah, and he's basically handed over most of the control at this point, I think, to the Octos. They're in control of the space ring, they're in control, and he's set them up with like solar cells, and so he has to kind of just sit there and watch as they solve the problem in their chosen way, which is...
And he's recording a lot of videos and journals and stuff very, very extensively for posterity. So he's just like observing and taking notes for who he doesn't know, because he's from his perspective, he is not at least not specifically aware of other humans that exist anywhere in the universe.
Right. And he like basically just wants to protect the Octos because they may be the last sentient, like uplifted, I should say sapient, right, in the sense of like intelligent beings in the universe besides this creature. And what's cool is they solve the problem in their own way, which is turning all those solar cells around and nuking the shuttle on its way over so that it crashes into the ocean and gets buried. And the other important sequence, and then we should probably get over to the philosophy that I wanted to cover, is the releasing of that and how that goes for the Octo people. So,
we cover a broad swath of time where this passes into legend, where it is just known by the octopuses, you don't mess with this part of the sea where this thing exists. It is off limits. You don't do anything with it. You don't touch it. You stay the hell away from it because it's bad. And their society just exists with that knowledge and understanding for a long time.
And it eventually fades, and eventually an Octo decides that, like, in order to seize power and help his species, he's going to go open the box and get the power out of the box. And so they open it, and the creature wakes up because it can live forever, essentially, in hibernation. And this is a wonderful sequence where the creature, just like when it struggled to absorb the humans, also doesn't like water and really doesn't like Octos, it turns out. Because of their distributed cognition, which we'll talk about in a second, they are hyper-resistant to the creature and end up just killing themselves themselves as it tries to absorb them. So it takes a lot longer for it to start to take over Octo and like actually keep them from murdering themselves, essentially. But you get a sequence where it spreads slowly across the planet, and because the Octos are not that organized, they flee in every direction, which essentially means up into the space ring eventually. And then you get one of the like coolest, creepiest set pieces, I think, in any of the series. Where, one of them decides that the only way to save the species and isolate the creature is to disconnect all of the connections to the space ring. And so they blow the connections that are full of Octos trying to flee. And it's like the worst, saddest version of like save the species by murdering a bunch of individuals. And it's super depressing, but also like really interesting in the way that it then traps the Octos in the ring and forces them to go out into space, essentially.
And, there's been a lot of world building up to this point, making it very clearly understood that octopuses have a hard time working together. Like, they're a social species in a way that, like, Earth octopuses, as we understand them, aren't generally a social species. But they still do have some sort of like antisocial elements, and they have a hard time like coming together over things. And of course, a bunch of them living in close proximity in this it's a setup for conflict that we will get into later.
Right, but so, they couldn't set up quarantine because they're not that kind of species. Right. So it's like, all of the sequences with the Octos are often like one daring Octo gets an idea in its crown and like blows some stuff up, and that's kind of the solution.
after doing a very pretty interpretive dance.
Right. Does a very, very pretty interpretive dance and then blows some things up. But like the same thing happens with the ships, where it's just like they're all stuck on the ring, and then one of them is just like, screw it, whatever, I'll do what I want, and like builds a ship and leaves. And some of them join it and some don't. And like, I love the ships the ships themselves are kind of anarchistic, where when they start to jump or accelerate, like if you're in the wrong space, bad news for you. There's not a lot of safety protocols in the Octo world, is the kind of vibe you get.
Specifically aligned along those lines are the most prominent cause of death is curiosity.
Yeah. It's such a perfect encapsulation of how curiosity is the ultimate evolutionary adaptation, but also a costly one on the individual level, right? Curiosity is absolutely like the group progresses while the individual doesn't necessarily. We talked about that in the After Dark a little bit with Stranger in a Strange Land last time, and like their, first level of life cycle where they kind of run about and do whatever they want, and most of them get murdered from it, and that's like just how their system works. So I love that.
All right, well, that feels like a good place to stop for part 2 in terms of plot. There's lots more tentacly spidery goodness to come, but for now, I think it's time to head into subtextual space.
I mean, Captain, I think it's probably important that we grok it. What we're talking about on this one, and this is building some on what we talked about last time and something we talked about previously, is the concept of distributed cognition, which is a kind of, thankfully a philosophical term that kind of is explaining what it is in the title. It is the idea of the way in which what we normally think of as the mental activities of an individual can actually be vastly more distributed than our kind of first-person unified perspective might give us the illusion. And we talked in a previous episode about like the, itty-bitty Paul's first distributed cognition, which is an article that I used to do when I did AI about airplane cockpits, where the idea would be that a classic example of distributed cognition is an individual distributes certain tasks into the technical environment around them. So we all do this now with our computers when we give it, the job of assigning, scheduling and stuff like that. We all move slowly towards Black Mirror in that way, but also
that is literally a project I'm working on at the moment.
I know that you can feel very comfortable luxuriating in this topic because you are currently setting up a glowy AI overlord in your house, which is great. Yeah. I'm glad that your Skynet's going to be really, really neon. I'm super stoked about that.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
in the classic cockpit model, what's really interesting is distributing cognition isn't just about offloading tasks, it's also about changing the nature of tasks. So tasks like maintaining the right speed to land properly, instead of making that a complicated mathematical task that's burdening the pilot, you make it a visual task. You make it a little, try to keep this line in place with this other line. If you play a lot of video games, you're very familiar with this concept that a task can be much easier or harder if you can redesign it in some way where it's visual instead of numbers or something. So
well, one of my favorite pastimes right now is Microsoft Flight Simulator. So I'm actually familiar in a direct way with that concept.
Right, exactly. Right. And if you're familiar with the internet speak of word cells versus shape rotators, right? If you're one or the other in terms of whether you're more comfortable with language or more comfortable with object manipulation, being able to take a task that's in one form and swap it to the other could make things much easier for you. So what I love about this book, though, is that it goes way, 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 way beyond the basics of distributed cognition by looking at 5 or 10 different kinds of distributed cognition. In the previous book we looked at with this, Blind Sight, which is a really wonderful book, and we'll do a short story related to this in the near future hopefully with a special guest. In Blind Sight, it's a lot of technologically distributed cognition still. It's a person has an implant that allows them to connect to a computer or allows them to connect to a drone or something like that, and that's a very 101 version. But here we've got 5 or 10 different versions, especially if you recognize that distributed cognition means social cognition too, right? So if you and I split up a math problem and each do half of it and then put it together and solve it, you and I solve that, did the cognitive process of solving that math problem, right? Social cognition is an incredibly important part of human intelligence. And, we've seen the way that the internet has allowed for increased density and thereby increased informational explosion in that sense. So with all that in mind, how many different, let's just list, how many can you think of versions of what we would call distributed cognition are in this one book?
Gosh, I mean, if we talk about it broadly, there's a lot, right? Because that is, obviously the creature from Nod, which we get the sense that that's happening even before we get it explicitly, because they do the world building of talking about how these creatures seem to be moving in concert with one another.
The dance,
yeah. But they also, they talk about that with the octopuses as well. And not in the same way as the creature from Nod, in a way that is we might loosely use the word telepathic to describe. That's probably not entirely accurate, but it's kind of conceptually similar.
It's like murmurations with bird packs is the way what it makes me think of.
Oh yeah, that's a really good way to put it, actually. And then the spiders have it with their understandings. And so it's not as actively exchanged in real time the way that a more telepathic type of distributed cognition would work. But I think the spiders are an interesting way of doing it in that there's some knowledge that everyone is just born with, and that I think you could argue. I think you may have to interpret the term distributed cognition a little more broadly to include that under the umbrella, but it feels close enough to at least mention and maybe talk about in the same context. There is Kern, who is a series of wires and mostly ants.
Mostly ants.
And then even there is an instance of Kern that lives inside of Artifabian, who it's a very interesting line with Artifabian where he starts to recognize himself as more of an individual, then starts to value that individuality, and then realizes that he was programmed to do that.
Yep.
which like undercuts that whole concept, which is just beautiful.
It very much is the Rick and Morty "you were created to serve butter" kind of
Right.
vibe. It's very funny. No, it is fun because you're seeing all, like, again, different versions of uplifting, right? Artifabian is being kind of uplifted as a construct through the inputs of these other different minds in this way, and as it does so, it becomes increasingly like reflective, and then starts to have anxiety like the rest of us.
Right, which that comes back to the morality of uplifting. Do we want to give another creature the ability to experience anxiety?
Right, one of the greatest memes of all time, right? You didn't create a human, that's just an ape with anxiety. You just screwed up an ape there, God.
Or the picture of Tiktaalik, like, this asshole left the ocean and now I have to pay bills. Thanks.
Yep. Leaving the ocean was a mistake, but I just watched a video of an actual octopi in the real world that made me think that the ocean itself is also a mistake. So maybe, maybe the antinatalists are right. Maybe life is really just a mistake, and that's the takeaway from all of this.
Yeah.
You got a really sense of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and there's the VR environment that the octopuses initially learn in. There's some really interesting exploration of that, and so that creates that sort of connection among them that feels deeper and more real than, like, if you and I were to, like, jump into Horizon Worlds together or something like.
Well, yeah, it seems like they have virtual avatars in a way that, like, if we play video games right now, unless we play them with really good VR tech, like, we're nowhere close to that level.
Right.
And that's sort of an interesting situation where consciousness is distributed between sort of two representations of an individual, the physical one and the virtual one, and that sort of expands the sensory experience for them.
Yeah. So how'd I do? Are there any ones that you can think of that I
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much my list. So I've got Kern, we've got the Octos, and like there's multiple levels with a lot of these that we can talk about. Like an individual Octo is a distributed cognition, and the species acts in a weird kind of distributedly cognitive kind of way. Then you've got Artifabian, but you've also got Artifabian connected to Fabian connected to what is the Meister? What is the other guy's name? I always forget this guy's name. The one working with Fabian. Know.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about too, but I can't remember the name either.
Right.
So bad at that.
And then you've literally, you've got the crew of the ship, which is a group working together, and you see the moments when in combat where they're like communicating between each other. In this sense, you've got the virtual worlds, like you said. You've also got the human that's working with Artifabian is a sectioned consciousness. His consciousness is itself divided into sort of modules, and yeah.
Right, yeah, because there's one point where Kern is like, I can't give you any more processing power. You're going to have to chill for a second.
Right, exactly. So, and I love this because it doesn't just move on the axis of a single first-person perspective expanding its sort of what we would think of as boundary of self kind of out into the world. It's actually entities that are hard, I think, for us to mentally conceptualize because they reject, in a sense, the notion of a first-person perspective, which we are so fundamentally attached to, right? When we think of consciousness, we implicitly always are thinking first-person, unified, the person in the Cartesian theater watching everything happening from that one view screen kind of thing. But like the Octos, for example, are a great rejection of that.
Well, and I'm curious what your thoughts on this are, because I mean, throughout the time where I was trying to talk about like the different versions of distributed consciousness, I'm interested on your thoughts on where you would actually draw the line, where you would start to use that word, because like you were talking about, or birds seem to spontaneously do the same thing, and I think there's really no evidence for us to know that that they communicate telepathically with one another, and so there's got to be something else at work. And like, to bring it back to this story, a lot of at least what I interpret, I don't think it's ever explicitly said, but the idea that I get is that what's happening with the octopuses is not that there is any sort of like telepathic type communication. It's just that they are so attuned to like the behavioral cues of other people, of their, the colors that their skin is changing, the dances that they're doing. So like on one level, that is just one individual communicating with another individual in a way that you or I might communicate. And I can read your mood by looking at your body language or by listening to your tone of voice. But there are involuntary reactions that I can have as a result to that. And I feel like maybe I could argue that is a form of distributed consciousness, but like, I think that may be stretching it a little bit. And I'm not sure, like, where do you personally see that line start to become less blurry?
Oh, no, I'm totally like, it's distributed cognition all the way down. And like a lot of the distributed cognition work actually turns inward and says, look, your sense of being a unified brain is inaccurate. Like your own first person perspective is the consensus of a bunch of different processes, and like you're not consciously aware of large amounts of what's getting selected for or against in your data processing, in that kind of sense. But yeah, so like, in those situations of socially distributed cognition, I do think often what could be happening, and this actually does go back to Blind Sight. I don't think you've ever read Blind Sight because you weren't around for that part.
I'm interested.
It's a very hard sci-fi in the sense of like sciencey side of things, and the main character has a kind of, you could almost say sort of sociopathy or anti-empathy, low empathy disorder, where they kind of have blind sight. They don't have a sense of their own inner mind, but they also don't experience the inner minds of others. But they can read surfaces, is the way to describe it, really well. So they can like see a person and like read what's going on just by like observing them on a surface kind of level. And I think what you also would see with like the octos is, like you said, a high level of sensitivity to surface response in this kind of sense. And that could be something that's going on with birds. I don't know. I'm not a bird lawyer. But I think that is just like a kind, it could be a very rapid kind of social cognition and response, which to me is no different from, so I don't know if you know this about human beings, why we have the whites around our eyes.
No.
What it's good for. It actually serves a purpose, people think, which is it's much easier to see where a person is looking when you have whites in your eyes. And there are a couple of reasons that could be valuable. So one would be hunting. If I see where you're looking, I can track a creature faster, right? Another one is in social cues. So one place this comes up is in social dominance or status awareness. Humans are very good at assessing who has high status in a situation. And one of the ways we do it is by looking where other people's eyes are in a room, right? Think the classic example of like someone up on a stage, very easy to figure out who's the high status individual. Everybody's staring right at them. So along with us being really good mimics, we're really good interpreters of other people's attention. I think that can all be a kind of socially distributed cognition. I think about the way like human mobs work, right? Where, the energy picks up from one person to another and spreads so quickly that it's kind of not conscious in that sense.
Right. Yeah. And then to then apply that to the octopuses in the story, my understanding is that they don't have understandings explicitly in the way that spiders do, but they do have a form of that. And so they have like that on top of everything else. As part of the because it's the Ruz Khalifi virus. We get the name of the virus in the book, and so they don't. I don't know that they have understandings just like the spiders do, but they have their own version of that, and so it accelerates that the notion a little bit more that they might be a little bit more of a collective. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, and you could also, there are various versions of extended cognition or distributed cognition that you could argue are across time as well. So human culture is a kind of distributed cognition that goes back thousands of years, and our ability to retain and inherit that information through writing is a kind of distributing of the growth of human knowledge in this kind of sense. The octopi, like the porters have it with the memory kind of thing. The octos seem to inherit that to some extent as well. It reminds me a little bit of like in Dune, because everything reminds me of Dune. The Bene Gesserit witches inherit when they become Reverend Mothers. They become connected to a collective consciousness that goes back to the like beginnings of time kind of thing, essentially. And so they're in commune with all of the like, Yodas of the Bene Gesserits, all your glowy, old ladies sitting around kind of situation. And that's a kind of distributed cognition, right? But like one thing that I love about the octos is usually, again, the distributing is still unified often into one mind at the end of the day. So when we think of a mob, we think of it forming a super mind or something like that, or cultures being a kind of super mind. But the octos stay distributed, and it's why the Nod creature can't deal with them so well, is that as they describe it, the crown can't see the first person perspective of the tentacles. It can get, reports from the tentacles, but it's sort of like there's a separate first person perspective in each tentacle, I think is the way you're supposed to think of it. And they kind of all fight for themselves, right? And, if you think about the way that organisms, and I love how this stuff plays with this idea that like multicellular organisms are essentially communes of cells that come together and agree to work together for everyone's benefit, right? And there are different levels of distribution of cognition up the sort of phylogenetic spectrum, and you can see how it could be the sort of case that like the crown is like one cluster of cells, right? I think even the creature from Nod, or maybe there's another story like this where they describe the brain in the human body as kind of like a tumor, and it's like this is a weird cluster of tumor cells that appears to be controlling like the rest of like what's the difference between a tumor and our brain evolving to be the dominant set of cells in a commune full of cells in this kind of sense. But you don't get far enough in that. So you just have like the tentacles do one job and the brain does another job, and they sort of connect sometimes.
Yeah. One of the most delightful things about this book is all of the really cool turns of phrase that Adrian uses, and one in particular that he uses to illustrate this point that we're talking about the octopuses is that the octopuses aren't sure if Syncovi is sentient like they are because they don't dislike him. And that's like because they have such a hard time,
right? Because they hate each other.
Devising the concept of another individual that doesn't annoy the crap out of them. That like because they don't feel that way about Syncovi, they're not sure if he's actually a person or not. Yeah,
and is this thing a person is such a great running gag throughout this series because like the octos are like their skin doesn't move. Are they sentient?
It's the screen. This has to be the
right. And the creature from Nod is like these things are confusing, and are these creatures a lot like what is this thing that like it doesn't make any sense? So there's an endless
on
series
both
of
accounts relatable. I get it. Like I don't blame them for feeling that way at all.
No, but I also like the other sort of different, if we think of like the different dials that you can play with for the distribution of cognition, there's things like fidelity across the organism, right? So the octo has like a very low fidelity in that the brain literally doesn't even know what the tentacles are thinking. And then you have, like the kern, which is a little more complicated. It seems like parts of it can get sectioned off from other parts, and they won't. And like as it sections off itself, based on how many ants it has, right? If you're at 1 million ants, then you're at like full processing and you're a full person. But you drop enough ants and you like are barely kind of a person. But that's an interesting one. Yeah.
And pronouns. I don't know. She talks about that a couple of times throughout where like she talks specifically like, oh, I'm trying to do this thing, but I can't because part of my brain's working on this other problem. Right. And it is like, it's not even a sectioning off, but it's a sectioning off that like makes each individual part smaller. So it's right. That's interesting.
And I do think that like this book makes a really good case that all of our pronouns should be we, they. Like
that's wow. I hadn't thought about that.
If we're being honest about the nature of distributed cognition, we're all we, theys out here.
Wow.
Cracking some eggs. Just making some omelets.
Wow. I just had a hell of a realization live during this recording.
We should put bigger warning signs. We should just have giant space warning signs. But the thing I wanted to point out that I think is fascinating about the creature from Nod is that usually when you have a thingy, like the thing from John Carpenter's The Thing kind of creature where, it's all of the parts are independent, but it's more like Kern, where if you have fewer parts, it gets weaker or like less conscious or something. But that doesn't appear to work with the creature from Nod. And I feel like we have the most trouble trying to make sense of what reality must be like for the creature from Nod, because it really seems to have to be that like every part of it is, every cell is a first person perspective, but there's also a way in which they kind of talk as a unity, and there's no loss of fidelity at every level. It's perfect fractal, knowledge at every level. That's a weird place to be. And not to spoil anything, but it gets played with a lot in book 3, but like even in book 2, you're just like, we can to varying degrees wrap our minds around different kinds of cognition, but stuff like that, I think we can talk about it, but we can't think about it. We can't feel about it.
So here's an interesting question based on all of this, while we're just having bigger and bigger realizations about how the less and less special we can claim to be as individuals. There's an interesting bit where the book describes what grief feels like for a spider.
Yeah, do you want to refresh on that?
I do, actually, because I copy pasted the section of the book because I think it is so well written. So it says, Portiids do not have the close family bond humans are so dependent on, but kindred minds of long association form a tight-knit sorority. Siblinghood, Portia corrects herself, a wave of her palps approximating a rolling of the eyes. Great gender politics stuff.
Good woke spider joke. Yep.
Yeah. Where the loss of a colleague leaves a gap in the network, a hole that drags the world out of shape with its absence. And so, if Viola's state of mind is not exactly like human grief, it is still a mournful acknowledgement that the world of today is at variance with the world of yesterday, and today is not the richer for it. Wow. Like, I just want to give Viola a hug.
Aww.
But it does, it's an interesting thing because I feel like what I often go to my argument is always about, in terms of like how to make the world a better place, is to expand our idea of what our in-group looks like. So more and more of us fall into what we think of as our community and those like us. And I think arguing on behalf of a distributed cognition and like just going ahead and calling culture that, I think logically it could lead to something like that too, where it's like, wow, actually the individual becomes less and less significant. And I think that's something that I have a very visceral reaction to. I don't like the idea of that at all, because it very logically leads to the individual being less valuable. And that's not a world that I want to live in at all. But I also feel like it's tough to escape that at least as a thing that is likely to happen, if not an inevitability.
Amazing that you went from loving the idea of it's all being we, they, to like going full anti-woke in the span of like 5 minutes. No joke.
We go on a journey on this podcast.
No joke. This is actually something that the anti-woke are really, really worried about. So one form of distributed cognition is social emotional learning, or social emotional cognition, or social cognition. There's lots of different language for these kinds of ideas, but essentially it is a rejection of the great person view of understanding. That like the previous view was the genius understands and everybody else learns from them. And now the view is individuals are kind of not super bright, even the best of them. They're all kind of biased, even the best of them. And the way we correct for this is, stuff like science. You could argue that, by the way, that like science as a concept is a kind of distributed cognition. That like the scientific process is actually just a thing distributed across a bunch of scientists, right? But the downside of this view is, people will say, oh, well, you're devaluing individual ingenuity. You're promoting a communist kind of approach to learning and understanding, all these kinds of et cetera, et cetera. And I think there is a concern there. I think it is true that, here's what I'll say. I think modernism corrected way too hard towards individualism. And I think, especially in the West, and quote unquote, the West, the West, another kind of distributed cognition.
Right.
We, the weirds, the capital all acronym weirds, are way too individualistic. And so we need kind of this corrective towards this kind of distributed idea of cognition. And the internet has kind of forced us to do it to some extent, right? We pretend that like the Elons of the world are running things, but really we know that like a million people are running things in this kind of way. So, you know, I do think that the result has been actually first the pull towards individualism created the modern crisis of isolation. I think the conservatives are right about that. They're just wrong about the solution being religion. You know, the solution is value-centered community that isn't religion.
Right.
But, you know, now we are seeing a shift back towards that kind of value-centered community. And I think that brings with it the kind of higher social cognition that is driving wokeness, essentially. That like when you have, you know, the basic idea of standpoint epistemology is a kind of distributed epistemic awareness. The more viewpoints you have, the fewer blind spots you have, essentially.
Yeah. Well, the thought that occurs, continuing that train of thought, is thinking that like, I mean, I already recognize that like if someone who is very, very close to me dies, I can simultaneously recognize that as a gigantic, momentous, important loss for my world, while understanding that society as a whole is going to go on tomorrow, regardless. And I think, I don't know. I mean, there's a world in which we can argue that those ideas have an at least inherent possibility of conflicting with one another. But then I also think about like, I mean, that's the place that I live in now, right? Like, if I'm experiencing a tremendous grief, I can understand why I would feel that way, and yet I'm not actually angry at the rest of the world for like continuing to live life tomorrow.
And I think
so. Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, I think the drawing on the spider thing that you referenced, which I think is really wonderful, it highlights that like the understandings alone are not the person. And maybe that would be true for something like the creature from Nod. Maybe the creature from Nod is literally just nothing but understandings. But for the rest, you know, like it can only mimic the understandings it absorbs, essentially. But like for the rest of us, we are kind of generative processes of our own, right? We create originality, like we do it, you know, by spinning the stuff that we already have, but in novel ways. But like there's a process that's the person that is separate from their understandings that you value, separate from the understandings that it generates. And there's a lot of stuff in like care ethics, for example, about how you can value people intrinsically without any of that other kind of stuff. And I do think that is a valuable corrective to the kind of not good valuing of individuals that you sometimes see in some of the modernist approaches. I also think it's worth noting there are several ways that this book plays with this question, and another is the naming convention thing that we've talked about repeatedly. If you have, you know, the same Paul over all of this time, right, you're kind of reducing the individuality of every single Paul in that sense, but you're also creating this image of an extended cognition across time again, where it's like the lineage of Paul as a lineage of a extended conscious being. I'll just add one more thing here, and I'm curious to hear sort of other major pieces of this for you. But like Derek Parfit, who also does a lot of other weird, you know, does the weird teleporter kind of questions, also makes an argument for kind of humans and conscious beings as like 4D entities, where there are like time slices of you at each point, and you are the composite of all of those kinds of time slices. And so in that sense, like you over time is a distributed cognition across all of those slices.
I'm a time sandwich.
You are, right.
Bunch of slices together.
You know, or a time quiche, or a time depends on your overtime anarchy views. Right.
That short circuited my brain. Thinking about me as pie or a sandwich.
Yeah.
I like that.
While we're here and like we're in the weird place, there's something actually I wanted to tie this to that's like a bit of a left turn, but I think will be useful and fun, which is to talk about a weird concept in philosophy called monads. I don't know
Yeah. You said this in our group chat, and I deliberately only looked up the like 2-sentence long definition because I want to. How'd
that go for you?
Experiencing the laugh that you just heard. That's how well it went for me.
Right, monads are a concept in metaphysics, which give you an idea of how much fun that can be. No, Metaphysics can be fun if you have the right teacher. I had one who was a really good metaphysics teacher, and I tried to steal all of his tricks. Ethics is much easier.
I thought you said metaphysics T-shirt for a second.
T-shirt.
And I was like, wow, we're going on a
very weird
journey. Yeah, we're going on an adventure.
So what did you pick up from that 2-sentence about monads? I'm actually curious how that went for you.
The sense that I got is that it is some way of explaining like the most base material that reality is constructed of.
Right.
Which I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I know just enough to feel like I have maybe the like surface tension on the surface of the water level understanding of what that means in a broader sense. But yeah, I'm actually really excited for your explanation of this.
Yeah, so a lot of the like 18th, 19th century philosophy, alongside the kind of scientific revolution and the like study of nature and all these kinds of things, was really that like sequence in the show where the character just says enhance and taps the button over and over again, and it's just like enhance, like trying to get down. Like, think of the classic example of this is actually Descartes. Excuse me, I was just gonna say Cart. Me and Cart hanging out, carton.
My buddy Cart.
Me and C Cart. Descartes, I guess that would be. Okay, this has really gotten off the rails. Descartes has the cogito, I think therefore I am. And this comes of his attempts to try to drill down to a foundational knowledge, something that like he could know for certain, and we could build up from there kind of thing. There was a lot of people doing this kind of drilling down activity. And in the metaphysical world, it's a lot of like making sense of the concept of substance. So what is substance, right? We have this world, everything seems to be interacting with other stuff. How is it doing that? Well, boy, let's try to find out. And you get all sorts of weird answers, right? And this is where you're going to get things like dualism versus monism. And, so maybe maybe there are two kinds of substance, mental ones and physical ones, and they play together, or like God sends messages between them or something. These are all actual positions. One that, the occasionalism one is actually the one taken by the guy who's also the one who popularized monads, which is Leibniz. So we're going to talk about Leibniz and Spinoza here for a second. So if you think about metaphysics as like enhance down to like what is the basic nature of the universe, which some would argue is just what physics is doing, and it gets down to strings or something like that. But these folks are like, we're going to do it, but without all that hard sciencey kind of stuff. We're just going to think real hard about what it would have to look like. And what they come to are a couple of different things, and monads are one version. And think of it kind of like the perfect atom. Okay, so an atom originates as a concept back in the ancient Greek worlds. I'm sure there's probably other places where versions of this originate, but one of the versions is like, this is just the thing that's inseparable, right? If I take you, I can cut you in half, and I can cut those pieces in half, and I can cut those pieces in half, and eventually I get down to something I can't cut in half anymore. We're going to call that an atom. Right. It is indivisible in that sense. And of course, then we split those into pieces. We see how that went.
Subatomic particles.
Kept enhancing, and you keep splitting and splitting, and eventually you get down to a question mark, right? You get down to strings, or who knows, right? Everyone gets really, really confused. Quantum something, right? So monads are the version of this. It's like when you get down to the indivisible, there's these things called monads, and because of a bunch of logical arguments that I'm absolutely not going to even pretend to try to lay out, the features of these are as such. They are like perfect mirrors of the universe. So every monad is a mirror of all of the information, and thereby contains all of the information in the universe. Every particle in this sense is a perfect fractal representation of the universe. Is how I understood it when I did this I'm probably getting this really wrong, not a metaphysician, but like it's something like that. It's something that's very, very similar in my mind to The Creature from Nod, where it's like every cell has everything in it. It's all the things. So in order for basically the solutions to like how does everything interact is everything is made up of these things that are kind of like mirror neurons. And I think there's some connections to these ideas where human cognition is based on the mirroring of awareness between us in this kind of sense, and these things are just like all the mirrors of the universe essentially.
Wow, that's
Very weird. Very, very
Yeah.
weird. Right? This is usually contrasted with Spinoza's version of the universe, which is a much more kind of panpsychist view. And we'll talk about panpsychism more down the line when we do a discovery episode and talk about mycelial networks. But in the meantime,
mushrooms.
We are the mushrooms of the universe. So Spinoza's view is more like everything's a big blanket, right? We can do I Heart Huckabees here. It's like everything's a big blanket, and it's just all one big blanket,
nice.
right? And the blanket is God, but not the bad kind of God, like a good kind of God, not a personal God that makes weird choices and tells people to do things they shouldn't do, but like God. It's called God or nature, and it's a kind of super conscious, non-conscious, non-personal being, and everything in it is like all physical things also have a mental mirror in them, and everything is fully distributed, and like all of us are just like variations on that surface of that fabric kind of thing, right? We're just like ripples on that fabric. If you like Taoism, it can kind of be like you have the Tao that's undifferentiated, and then like the tree comes up out of it and then falls back down into it kind of vibe, which is very different to me than the nod creature or the monads, right? You might think, well, all of this is silly. It's just particles. Stop talking silliness. But what I do think is valuable about comparing these ideas is thinking about the way that it makes the universe a very different place conceptually, right? Rather than a place of individual, indivisible, perfect, complete entities that are fully separate from each other, but interact, it's a one unified fabric that like parts of it have the illusion at various points that they are individual separate things, but they are really not.
Yeah, and I was actually going to ask you if like is this mostly a philosophical exercise, or is there something broader to be gained there? And I as I was thinking about that question myself, I was thinking like, I mean, even at the very least, it is cool just to have a more clear or accurate understanding of like how reality works, even if there's not necessarily a moral or ethical implication. Like it's just cool to have more information about how the universe works, which is like rad and valuable in itself. But I am interested in like, talk to me about your thoughts about like the implications of like real world morality and ethics.
Right. So the classic easy like dunk quote here would be Albert Einstein saying, if I believe in God, I believe in Spinoza's God. Which is to say, philosophy like this is not science, but it may inspire scientists to think about the world differently, and then they do different experiments, and then they discover relativity, or, they stop thinking of things objectively and start thinking of them like processes, and that changes how they study them in this kind of way. Psychology changes when you start thinking about individuals not as separate, discrete entities, but as, complex interflowing processes in this kind of way. So I think, broadly speaking, I think there's value to, like, I'm a Spinozan is what I'll say, right? I think it's better to see the world as the blanket than as a bunch of different separate marbles in this kind of way, right? Different little cosmos, I think. And I think there's something to that, right? If like it might be the case that what we end up with string theory is something like that, where there really aren't like separate strings. It's just waves bumping into other waves or something. But whatever's going on down at that level, I do think up at our level, it's very valuable as another kind of way of being reminded that our cognition is vastly distributed out across our environment, our space, the people around us, and that totally shapes who we are, how we think, etc. And that can, you were describing the kind of existential crisis of us becoming unimportant. There's also a luck crisis here, obviously. And I know we're out of time, but I'll just put a note in it and say that like a lot of the stuff that I do in the conspiracism world is about bad luck epistemology, and like a lot of bad luck in epistemology is the bad luck of what environment you're raised in, like where your cognition gets distributed. If your cognition gets distributed around 1930s Germany, that's really bad luck for you. But we can't, we can remember that like it is bad luck, and these aren't separate, unique entities that have the kind of intellectual control that they should be held responsible. We're all just distributed in this way, and we all got to help each other do better in that kind of sense.
we are no better than the ants that make up Evrona Kern.
That's right. Right. We all got to come together. We are, well, or we could say, like the creature of Nod, we are only as good as the most advanced among us,
Yeah.
And we all benefit when there are more advanced among us if we see ourselves as we rather than us versus them or I versus thou.
I, we, they. That's everybody's. All pronouns are valid here. Well, that
all
that
plural
feels
pronouns.
like a pretty, yeah, that pretty well. That feels like a pretty good place to call it a day on part 2 of Children of Ruin. I love this book so much, and I legitimately learned a lot from this philosophy section. You threw out some conceptual terms that I'm like, I'm gonna do a little bit of base level research, but I feel like I had several consciousness raising moments, so I appreciate that. So of course, next time on Philosophers in Space, we're going to be doing our final episode of Children of Ruin, and it's gonna get gooey. It's going to get so gooey.
Yep. We're going to talk about the problem of unity. So our first one was the problem of separateness. And now we're going to talk about what happens. So similar to what you were concerned about there, if we get a little too unified, maybe.
Yep.
But, you also put it here in a way that I think is really important, which is this podcast is a kind of distributed cognition. We are sharing this cognition between each other and out into the world across time and space. And we get to do so because people are supporting that, right? Our gods or natures out there being the substance of our podcast universe. So we want to thank those folks. We are, again, now thanking all our new patrons as well as our top tier patrons. And we have a couple new patrons. We got a lot of we's on this one. Much new to the collective. So I want to thank our new Cosmic Mycelium Network patrons for being our very good little mushroom substrates. Thanks to Todd Roser Davies, Joe, Jim O, White House for White House 2024, and Strat Engineer. And thanks to our newest red shirts, Claude Dion, Audrey Arnett, Noah Dietrich, Support Your Local Peruvian Restaurant, Jonathan Warnson, John McClellan, Buoyant Citrus, Colin Armstrong. Oh, these are our new Jerry patrons, Colin Armstrong and Robert. And we have a new annual Mycelium patron, Avin Zarles. And we have a new strong AI patron, Randall Nelson Peterman, and a new annual red shirt, John the Battletoads expert. Okay, I think that's everybody.
Oh, Battletoads expert.
Yeah.
I need that in my life. I never could get past the underground level with the cars.
Oh, yeah. Now you can just go watch the distributed cognitive speedruns. And all the thanks to our strongest AIist that distributes so much consciousness, so much quick, faster patrons. As I said, Randall Nelson Peterman, Corey Ebert. She packed my bags last night, pre-flight, 0 hour, 9 a.m. Give to monitsknees.org, then visit deepfakestop.com. Big easy blasphemy. A wise Zen once said, you can't be neutral on a moving train. Jesse Rabinowitz and Brenda Goodman. Dude, Alex Arnett, and Jesta. And all the thanks to our definitely, absolutely, pretty sure you're not a clone, you're just a perfect copy of us because we're all one patrons, Alex Benishek, and yelling at podcasters is para-anti-social. Thank y'all.
Yes, thank you all very much. It's very, very cool to have seen all of this happen, and I just love and appreciate so much. And so with that,
I was going to say, apparently, if you want me to say your name slower, you have to make it something that I have to imagine being said by Shatner.
Well, that sounds like a challenge
That's how that works,
folks. So for the next episode, get those Patreon names changed. So with that, I think it is time to head down to the abandoned cargo bay down below for some After Dark. So those of you headed there with us, go ahead and get your stuff together. You start heading that direction. The rest of you, thanks again for listening. We will see you next time. And Aaron, I have some thoughts about interspecies kink, and I just need to talk about it with someone. So you ready to head down and do some After Dark?
Hey, Callie, you want to distribute some cognition?
distribute the shit out of that cognition.
I do really feel like almost any philosophical phrase can be said using the like inappropriate voice, and it's
you just gotta
always
adjust
fun.
your delivery a little bit. Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Right. You just gotta do the tones right. Gotta tap the feet just right.
Thanks again to our listener units and patron units. Your support makes our internet broadcast possible. If you want to hear more from us, check out our other internet broadcasts, Queersplaining and Embrace the Void, as well as our wonderful editor Louisa Lyons filmed live musicals podcast. Leave them all 5-star ratings and reviews on your podcast application. You can follow us on Twitter at ZeroGPhilosophy or email us at philosophersinspace@gmail.com. If you want to support the show and get even more juicy sci-fi hot takes, consider joining the crew over at patreon.com/0G. Just $2 a month gets you early access to episodes and after dark content. Until next time, friends, stay gooey.